Okay, so I asked you to look at these two objects. I didn't really tell you what they were, and I asked you to describe anything that you thought was important about them, right? So let's start with this, right? So hopefully you figured out this was a compass that you can use to measure distance or draw a circle by mounting a pen in here. So what's important about this object, right? So usually students come up with a list of things that's something like this. You know, it has the tube that holds the pencil. There's that nice screw that allows us to adjust the pencil. It's got the hinge that allows us to adjust the distance. It's got a little screw also to hold that angle once we've picked it. The point that we can hold against paper. It's got these arms that allow us to space. We can sharpen the pencil. That's pretty useful. You know, it's made of wood instead of metal. There's graphite in there that allows us to make markings if we want, right? This isn't an exhaustive list, but these are a bunch of things that are important about this species. And you could think a little bit like, does it matter that this is black or that the pencil's orange? I would argue that it probably doesn't matter that this is black and that the pencil's orange, and that this would function equally well if it didn't have those colors. Probably not. All right, so let's go back to this object. What's important? And did anyone figure out that this is a paperweight? So this is a paperweight. So what's important about this? Well, it's heavy and it's flat on the bottom. And maybe people like things that are pretty. And so often students like to point out the colors, they like to point out the different shapes of these things, the fact that it's transparent, but just like the pencil, it doesn't matter that the pencil is orange, it's actually not relevant to the function of this, right? So functional ecology is about functional equivalence. Is there ways of cutting through the diversity of paperweights to understand something about their function, right? So it turns out there's a lot of ways to be heavy and flat on the bottom. And yeah, it's cool to, you know, there's also a lot of ways to be pretty and attractive, and I like to own pretty things as much as the next person. But those aren't that important to its function. Right, so ecologists have this idea that if evolution by natural selection shapes traits, as we've seen through our simple matrix games, remember the one of heterostyly? And it does that with all of the n dimensions, the unknown number of dimensions of the environment and biotic interactions, then we might be able to use traits to define the niche of a species, right? So maybe we don't have to know all of the n dimensions that shaped the evolution of a species. We just need to think about the functional traits, the function of those species, right? And the nice thing about traits is they're useful because they're often shared among species, while all dimensions of the niche are not. So there's a famous example with bats, actually, that I pulled from this old textbook, right? And the idea was they said, okay, well, all bats have wings and they have ears, and we can maybe measure the basic size and shape of their wing and the basic size and shape of their ear, and we might be able to create this sort of niche space for different bats. And what they were able to do was they saw that basically fruit bats and insectivorous bats clustered out in different ways. And I don't remember which is which, but the idea is that if you tried to compare like the diet items, you'd have a ton of zeros, right? So this fruit-eating bat doesn't ever eat a moth, it doesn't ever eat a fish, doesn't ever pollinate or eat nectar, and so you'd have a lot of zeros. But by using the traits, they have continuous variables for all of them, right? So you see that they find the same sorts of bats in Ontario and Cameroon with the same sorts of traits. So these must be the fruit bats, and these were the insectivorous bats. And you could even go beyond bats, right? So humans and birds and dinosaurs even have ear-like structures and wings, or arms rather, that we could begin to make comparisons among many, many, many species, right? So if you compare the length of the fingers on a human to the length of them on a bat, you're going to potentially learn something about the niche of those different species. So the key is that functional traits are often predictable, right? They represent evolutionarily stable strategy solutions to common ecological problems. And they converge on different forms, right? So here is a conifer, a monocot, and a dicot that are all trees. We can recognize all of these as trees, right? In the same way, we remember when we talked about evolution of whether or not evolution was predictable, we saw that dingoes, African wild dogs, wolves that occur in northern Russia and North America, and even the extinct marsupial Tasmanian tiger, they often converge on very, very similar forms. So it's important to remember, though, that traits are constrained by trade-offs, right? Trade-offs are a balance achieved between two desirable but incompatible features. It's sort of like a compromise, right? And I would argue there's three kinds of ways that you can get trade-offs in evolutionary ecology: genetic, allocation, and structural, right? So we could think, what are the genetic trade-offs? Well, one of them that Damon told you about in the first part of the class is pleiotropy, where you can have one gene that controls more than one trait, right? Or antagonistic pleiotropy, where one gene controls more than one phenotypic trait, but one of these traits is beneficial and the other one is detrimental. So how does evolution make a trade-off between these two things, right? And maybe it's not going to go all the way to the best value of the beneficial trait and all the way to the worst value of the deleterious trait. Linkage is another way we can get genetic trade-offs, right? Some traits move together. So even if it isn't perfect for evolution by natural selection, this trade-off and the fact that one gene sort of moves with another, means that there has to be some trade-off between the good gene and the bad gene. The other way is allocational trade-offs, right? A plant can't put the same carbon molecule in two places at the same time, right? That's what I mean by allocational trade-offs, right? So this means that if I'm going to produce leaves, that's going to necessarily reduce my ability to make other types of organisms. And so we can take a look at that if we look at, these are actual data of different species or different ecosystems, but we look at the amount that plants are allocating to stems versus roots and versus leaves, and I've just plotted all the possible pairs of that. You can see that the plants that have the most stems tend to have the fewest roots, and the plants that have the most roots tend to have the fewest stems. This is what I mean by an allocational trade-off. And of course, you can't allocate above this diagonal, right? So that's the hallmark of an allocational trade-off, that it forms this sort of lower triangle type shape if you're able to plot it from 0 to 1. And of course, we can also have structural, physical trade-offs, right? So remember, we already saw these giant 150-meter tall tropical trees that have these buttresses that keep them from tipping over. Organisms have to obey the laws of physics and chemistry, and this leads to trade-offs in their physical and chemical structure, right? So you probably can't have a 130-meter tall tree with a 1 centimeter diameter stem. It's just going to tip over. Although if someone else is going to invest in a really strong stem, then you actually can have vines that grow up and have really small stems. But again, often the trade-offs you see are physical, right? Or, a 130-meter tall tree with a root system the size of an Arabidopsis plant is probably also not going to work. Okay, so what traits are important for plant ecology? So I think I'm going to stop the video here, and in the next video we'll start to think about what sorts of traits are important for plant ecology and what are the trade-offs that shape them.